William Morrison never looked back until the day his past walked into the boardroom. A month after abandoning his wife with nothing but $200,000 in debt, he sat in a meeting, expecting another routine day of power. But when the new CEO entered, his blood ran cold. It was her. The night was alive with the hum of conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, the low bass of an exclusive lounge filled with men who had never known failure. William Morrison sat at the center of it all, leaning back in his chair with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. The restaurant, the luxury, the power, it all belonged to him. He had shaped his world into a kingdom where he was king, and everything around him moved according to his will. The business deal that had just closed had been another victory, another step in securing his name among the most influential men in the industry. His associates laughed, toasting to his success, their voices a blend of admiration and envy. William thrived in this atmosphere. It fueled him, reminded him of why he had fought to be at the top. A phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, his smirk deepening. It was a message from his lawyer. All finalized. You're free. He exhaled slowly, tipping his glass of bourbon to his lips before setting it down with deliberate satisfaction. That chapter of his life was officially closed. Sophia Monroe was no longer his wife, no longer his concern. Whatever debt she carried now was her burden alone. He had given her years of his life, and he was done pretending it was ever more than an arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. He had built himself up from nothing, and no one, especially not a woman who had become a financial liability, was going to slow him down. He barely thought about her as he turned back to his companions, indulging in another round of drinks. His life was meant for bigger things. He was already moving on. Sophia Monroe, however, was waking up to a reality that would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the man she had once called her husband. The morning light streamed through her apartment window, but there was no warmth in it. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of her, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up, debts she didn't remember signing off on, obligations that felt like a cruel joke. Her hands trembled as she flipped through statement after statement, every line a fresh wound. The house, the credit cards, the business ventures William had convinced her to attach her name to. The total number, $200,000 in debt, stared back at her, mocking her belief that William had ever truly cared about her well-being. Her phone buzzed with a call from the bank. She ignored it. Her stomach twisted with nausea, but there was no food left in the fridge. There was no safety net. William had moved on so seamlessly that it made her question whether she had ever really mattered to him at all. One moment, she had been his wife, standing beside him at galas, entertaining his business associates, believing she was part of something larger than herself. The next, she was nothing more than another problem he had efficiently erased. For days, Sophia felt like she was drowning. She barely ate, barely slept, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her like an iron cage. She had no one to turn to. She had spent years orbiting William's world, sacrificing her own ambitions to support his, believing in the illusion that they were building something together. She had been a fool. But if there was one thing Sophia Monroe had never been, it was weak. She wiped at her eyes, forcing herself to breathe, to think. There had to be a way forward. She wouldn't crumble under the weight of William's decisions. If he had expected her to disappear, to fade into the background as just another casualty of his ambition, he was about to be proven wrong. Sophia had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. The first step was finding a job, any job that would keep her afloat while she figured out her next move. She sent out resumes, walked into offices, sat through condescending interviews where men in suits barely looked at her before dismissing her as unqualified. It was humiliating, exhausting, but she refused to give up. She refused to let William's betrayal define the rest of her life. Then, on one particularly bleak afternoon, she met Elena Harrington. Elena was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she walked into a room. Powerful, sharp, unshaken by the chaos of the business world. Sophia had known of her. She was one of the most respected corporate strategists in the industry, someone even William had spoken about with grudging respect. Meeting her in person had been nothing short of fate. "You look like a woman who's been through hell," Elena had said, studying Sophia with an amused, knowing expression. But you don't look like the type to stay there. Sophia had swallowed the lump in her throat, straightened her shoulders. I'm not. And that had been the beginning. Under Elena's guidance, Sophia learned how to navigate the world William had always kept her on the outskirts of. She studied late into the night, absorbed every lesson, learned the intricacies of business, investments, corporate strategy. She attended meetings, watched how powerful men moved, how deals were made and broken with a single sentence. Slowly, she started to understand the game William had always played, and she learned how to play it better. She started making connections, investing in the right places, taking calculated risks that paid off. What had once seemed impossible, digging herself out of the financial ruin William had left her in, became a reality. And then, piece by piece, she started working her way into William's world, positioning herself in places he would never expect to see her. Until, finally, the moment arrived. It had been exactly 1 month since William had last thought about Sophia Monroe. 1 month since he had walked away from their marriage without looking back. He entered his corporate headquarters that morning expecting nothing out of the ordinary. The meetings on his schedule were routine. He had new deals to secure, more money to make. Then, his assistant informed him of an emergency board meeting. Unplanned, unscheduled. He barely paid attention as he walked into the conference room, expecting to hear another mundane report. But when he stepped inside, he stopped cold. Every seat at the table was occupied, but it wasn't the board members that caught his attention. It was the woman sitting at the head of the table. Sophia. She was dressed in a tailored black suit, her posture impossibly poised, her expression unreadable. She didn't look like the woman he had left behind. She looked in control. His stomach twisted, but he forced himself to smirk. What the hell is this? Sophia met his gaze, calm and unwavering. Sit down, William, she said. We have a lot to discuss. And for the first time in his life, William Morrison felt something entirely unfamiliar claw its way up his spine. A slow, chilling sense of fear. Imagine being in Sophia's place, betrayed, abandoned, and drowning in debt. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments. Would you fight back like she did or walk away and start fresh? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around. Things are just getting started. William's smirk wavered for only a fraction of a second, but Sophia caught it. She caught everything. The way his fingers twitched at his sides, the slight furrow in his brow before he smoothed it away, the sharp inhale he tried to conceal. It was almost imperceptible, but she knew him better than most. She knew what he looked like when he was caught off guard. And right now, William Morrison was completely blindsided. The boardroom was silent, the weight of expectation thick in the air. The men seated at the table, William's most trusted executives, exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. William was standing, rigid, on one side of the room. Sophia was seated at the head of the table, composed and confident, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. William was the first to break the silence. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if he had walked into some kind of joke. I don't know what game you're playing, Sophia, but I think you're sitting in the wrong chair. His voice was casual, but there was a forced quality to it, a strained amusement that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sophia didn't flinch. Actually, William, I'm exactly where I need to be. A murmur swept through the room. William's jaw tightened. He didn't like surprises, especially not ones he couldn't immediately control. He straightened his suit jacket, exhaling through his nose as he forced a smirk back into place. All right, I'll bite. You want to tell me what's going on here? Sophia folded her hands together, tilting her head slightly. I'd love to, but I think it would be better if you took a seat first. She gestured toward the chair directly across from her, the chair he had occupied for years. The chair that, up until today, had belonged to him alone. William's eyes darkened. He wasn't used to being told what to do, and certainly not by her. But the room was watching. His board members were watching. If he refused, it would look like he was rattled, and William Morrison did not get rattled. So, after a long, tension-filled pause, he pulled out the chair and sat. Start talking, he said, voice clipped. Sophia let a bead of silence stretch between them before she leaned forward slightly. You built this company, William. I'll give you that. But you made the mistake of assuming that just because you left me behind, I would disappear. That I would crumble under the weight of the mess you left me in. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You underestimated me. William forced out another laugh, but it was thinner this time. Underestimated you? Sophia, what exactly am I supposed to be impressed by here? You walked into a meeting you weren't invited to and took my chair for the shock factor? What's next? You going to tell me you're suing me for emotional damages? Sophia barely blinked. I don't need a lawsuit, William. I already own majority shares in Morrison Enterprises. The room went still. William's expression didn't change immediately. He stared at her for a moment, processing her words, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. And then, slowly, his smirk faded. What? Sophia crossed her legs, exuding a calmness that was almost cruel. You heard me. Over the past few months, I've been acquiring shares. Not just any shares. Your shares, William. The ones you leveraged as collateral for your last major acquisition. The ones you assumed no one would touch because you had a deal in place to buy them back. Except, that deal fell through, didn't it? William's fingers curled into fists on the table, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. That's impossible. Those shares weren't for sale. Even if they were, you wouldn't have the kind of money to. Sophia raised a brow. To what? To outmaneuver you? To pull the same kind of deal you've pulled on dozens of companies before? To use your own arrogance against you? A muscle in William's jaw twitched. Here's what you don't get, William, she continued, her voice steady. You taught me everything I needed to know. You didn't mean to, of course. You never once thought I was paying attention when you talked about business at those dinner parties, or when I sat next to you during negotiations. You thought I was just the pretty wife who smiled and nodded. But I was listening. I was learning. And when you left me with nothing, I decided to use those lessons for myself. William leaned forward, lowering his voice. You don't know what you're doing, Sophia. You think this is a win for you? You have no idea how this world works. I don't care what little deals you made or what tricks you pulled. You won't last in this chair. These people, he gestured to the board members, won't follow you. They know who built this empire, and it sure as hell wasn't you. Sophia let the insult roll off her like water. She glanced around the table, letting the silence speak for itself before turning back to him. You're right. They know exactly who built this company. They also know who's been making reckless financial decisions, who's been putting the company at risk to fuel his own ego, and who's been treating his employees like disposable assets. And most importantly, she said, eyes locking onto his, they know who legally holds control now. William's pulse roared in his ears. He could feel the stares of his board members, feel the power in the room shifting away from him like sand slipping through his fingers. He had spent years cultivating dominance in this space, years ensuring that no one could ever challenge him. And yet, sitting across from him, perfectly composed, was the woman he had left in the dust. A woman who now had the ability to destroy everything he had built. He wanted to lash out, to regain control, to force the narrative back into his favor. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had no idea how. Sophia let the moment linger, then stood, smoothing out the lapels of her blazer. This is just the beginning, William. You spent years making sure you were untouchable, but you made one mistake. You thought I would always be beneath you. You thought I would never fight back. She exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. But I'm not the same woman you walked away from. And this time, you don't get to decide what happens next. She turned to the rest of the board, her presence commanding. Meeting adjourned. I'll see you all first thing tomorrow morning. With that, she walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence so thick it was suffocating. William sat there, staring after her, his mind racing. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had already lost. William sat frozen in his chair long after Sophia had left the room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cough or shuffle from the board members who still lingered, waiting for him to react. But what was there to say? What had just happened was beyond comprehension. The woman he had written off, discarded like an outdated investment, had just taken his seat at the table. And not just metaphorically, she had literally taken control. She had outmaneuvered him, stripped him of the dominance he had always wielded, and left him grappling with something he had never truly experienced before: helplessness. A few of the board members exchanged looks before quietly excusing themselves, murmuring that they would reconvene the next morning. William barely heard them. He was staring at the table, his mind racing, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He needed to move, needed to do something, needed to fix this before it got out of hand. But the truth was, it already had. His assistant, Jordan, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Morrison, should I clear your afternoon meetings?" William blinked. It took him a second to process the words, a second longer to realize that, for the first time, his schedule wasn't the most important thing in the room. He inhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, before finally standing. "No," he said, his voice steadying. "Keep everything as it is. And give me everything you can on how this happened. I want details. Every transaction, every move she made. I want to know who helped her." Jordan nodded quickly and hurried off, leaving William standing alone in the now empty boardroom. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back as he forced himself to regain his composure. He had been caught off guard, yes, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sophia thought she had won something today, but she had no idea what she was getting herself into. This was his world. He had built this empire. And no matter what tricks she had pulled, no matter how clever she thought she wasn't going to take it from him. The thought settled something in him, reignited the fire that had momentarily been extinguished. He straightened his tie, smoothed out his suit jacket, and walked out of the boardroom with the same confident stride he had always carried. The people in the office, the employees who had built their careers under his leadership, still saw him as the man in charge. And for now, that was enough. But deep down, a small, insidious thought gnawed at him. What if Sophia wasn't just a temporary problem? What if she actually knew how to play this game? Sophia stepped into her new office, William's old office, and let out a slow breath. The room was just as she remembered, though she had rarely been in it before. William had always kept this space as an extension of himself, sleek, intimidating, meticulously designed to make anyone who entered feel as though they were beneath him. The towering windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, a constant reminder of the power he wielded. And now, that power was hers. She trailed her fingers along the polished surface of the mahogany desk before lowering herself into the leather chair behind it. It felt surreal. A year ago, she had been drowning in debt, struggling just to get through the day, abandoned by the man who had once vowed to stand by her side. But she hadn't broken. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, learning, adapting, evolving. She had done what William never thought possible. She had stepped into his world and claimed a space of her own. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Elena Harrington stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "That," she said, crossing her arms with a smirk, "was one hell of a power move." Sophia exhaled, allowing herself a small smile. It needed to be done. Elena walked toward the window, glancing out at the city. "I have to admit, when you first told me you wanted to take William down, I thought it was personal. I didn't think you had it in you to actually do it." "It was personal," Sophia admitted. "But it's more than that now." Elena turned, her expression unreadable. "So what's next?" Sophia glanced down at the desk, at the contracts and documents that detailed the intricate web of transactions she had pulled together to gain control. "William isn't going to back down. He's going to fight. And I need to be ready for that." Elena smirked. "Oh, he's absolutely going to fight. But the question is, are you prepared to win?" Sophia met her gaze, a quiet determination settling in her chest. "I didn't come this far to lose." William spent the next 12 hours tearing through every financial record, every stock exchange, every legal loophole that could have possibly allowed Sophia to make the move she had. He barely slept, barely ate, his mind consumed with one thought. How did I let this happen? By the time the sun rose, he had compiled enough information to understand the full scope of what she had done. And it was worse than he had imagined. She hadn't just acquired stock in the company. She had orchestrated a series of transactions so intricate, so calculated, that even he had to grudgingly admit how impressive it was. She had bought shares from small investors he had never paid attention to. She had secured partnerships with silent stakeholders, people who had once been on his side, but had jumped ship the moment they saw an opportunity for something greater. And she had done it all without him noticing. She had used his own arrogance against him. William clenched his jaw as he sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk. He had underestimated her. That much was clear. But now, it was time to remind her who she was up against. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Caleb," William said, his voice steady. "I need you to set up a meeting with the board. Today." And give me a full breakdown of Sophia's contract. Every clause, every loophole, anything I can use to put her in check." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Understood. I'll have everything ready within the hour." William hung up, exhaling slowly. Sophia thought she had won a battle, but she had no idea the war was just beginning. Sophia was reviewing reports when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sophia. Hope you're ready for what comes next." She stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone and setting it aside. She had expected William to retaliate. She just wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. William sat alone in his office, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down on him like a vice. His fingers tapped against the polished desk, his mind racing with every possible move he could make. He had faced hostile takeovers before, fought off competitors who thought they had the upper hand. But this was different. This wasn't some faceless corporate rival trying to outmaneuver him. This was Sophia, the woman he had left behind, the woman he had underestimated. And she had just proven to him that she was far more capable than he had ever given her credit for. He clenched his jaw, inhaling deeply as he leaned back in his chair. He couldn't afford to dwell on how this had happened. The only thing that mattered now was taking back control. He grabbed his phone and dialed Jordan's number. His assistant picked up on the second ring. "Tell me you have something," William said without preamble. There was a brief pause before Jordan spoke. "I pulled everything we could find on Sophia's transactions. It's airtight. She didn't just buy shares, William. She built a network. Quietly, carefully, over the course of months. She aligned herself with stakeholders who had grievances against you, positioned herself in ways that made her look like the better alternative. And most of them, they're backing her." William exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening around the phone. "There has to be something. A weakness. A way to push her out." "Not legally," Jordan admitted. "Her shares give her authority, and with the board's current sentiment, she has the majority vote. She's in a position to make executive decisions. She played this flawlessly, William. And that means we're out of options, unless you can get her to step down voluntarily." William let out a humorless laugh. "And how exactly do you suggest I do that?" "Beg." Another silence. Then Jordan hesitated. "She had help." William stilled. "Who?" "Elena Harrington." William's expression darkened. "Of course. You should have seen it." Elena was one of the most ruthless business strategists in the industry. She had been a problem for him before, an opponent he had learned to avoid because she played the long game, and she always won. "Get me a meeting with Elena," William said. Jordan hesitated again. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "Just do it." William ended the call, his mind already calculating his next move. If he couldn't shake Sophia's position directly, he would have to go through the person who had made it possible in the first place. But even as he thought it, something inside him twisted. Because despite everything, despite his anger, his need to reclaim what was his, there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the truth. He was impressed. Sophia had done what no one else had ever managed to do. She had outplayed him. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him the most. Sophia stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been William's office, sipping her coffee as she watched the city come alive beneath her. The morning light cast a soft glow over the skyline, illuminating the world she had fought so hard to claim. And yet, even as she stood there, victorious, she knew the battle was far from over. William wouldn't go down quietly. He was already planning his next move. She could feel it, sense it in the way he had looked at her during the meeting. He wasn't the type to accept defeat. If anything, this would only make him fight harder. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Elena stepping inside, a knowing smirk on her lips. "Well, you certainly made an impression," Elena said, crossing the room to take a seat. "Half the board is in awe of you. The other half is terrified. I'd say that's a solid start." Sophia let out a quiet laugh, setting her cup down. "It's not enough. William isn't going to back off. He's going to come after me with everything he has." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Of course he is. That's what makes this fun." Sophia sighed, rubbing her temples. "I didn't do this for fun, Elena." "No," Elena agreed. "You did this for revenge." Sophia stilled. Elena tilted her head, watching her carefully. "I've been in this game a long time, Sophia. I know what ambition looks like, and I know what revenge looks like. You didn't take this company because you wanted power. You took it because you wanted to watch William suffer. Sophia swallowed, her hands tightening at her sides. Does it matter why I did it? The point is, I succeeded. Elena leaned back in her chair, studying her. For now. Sophia exhaled slowly, turning back toward the window. She didn't need to be reminded that this wasn't over. She had spent months planning, orchestrating every step, anticipating every possible outcome. But there was one thing she hadn't fully accounted for. What happened after she won? Because now, with everything in her hands, she wasn't sure if victory felt as satisfying as she had imagined it would. William arrived at the private club where Elena had agreed to meet him, his mind sharp, his emotions carefully controlled. He didn't allow himself to feel the weight of what had happened. He didn't allow himself to think about the fact that his company, his legacy, was no longer in his hands. This wasn't about emotions. This was about strategy. And if there was one thing he knew, it was how to play the game. Elena was already seated when he arrived, a glass of wine in her hand, her expression unreadable. She was a woman who never showed her cards too soon. William, she greeted smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? He slid into the chair across from her, his gaze steady. You made this happen. Elena smiled. She made this happen. I just pointed her in the right direction. You could have backed anyone, William said. Why her? Elena took a sip of her wine before setting the glass down. Because she had something you didn't. William's jaw tensed. And what's that? Elena leaned in slightly, her eyes sharp. Something to prove. William exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. You know this isn't over. I would be disappointed if it was, Elena admitted. A long silence stretched between them before Elena finally sighed. If you're looking for a way to undo this, you won't find one here. Sophia isn't just playing at power, William. She's earned it. You can fight her, sure, but ask yourself, what happens if you lose again? William didn't flinch. I don't lose. Elena smirked. Then prove it. William stood, adjusting his jacket. Oh, I will. As he walked away, Elena watched him go, amusement flickering in her gaze. This was going to be interesting. Back in her office, Sophia received a new message. William just met with Elena. Be ready. She closed her eyes for a moment before setting her phone down. She had been expecting this, and she wasn't afraid. William strode into his penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath him, a view he had once found exhilarating. Now, it did nothing to quell the frustration simmering just beneath his skin. He loosened his tie, tossing it onto the nearest chair, and exhaled sharply. The meeting with Elena had been exactly what he expected, cryptic, smug, and ultimately useless. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to undo what she had helped Sophia build. Sophia. He had spent years thinking he understood people, knowing exactly how to control them, how to push them in the directions he wanted. But he had never once considered that she would be the one to outplay him. And that was exactly what she had done. He poured himself a drink, his hands steady despite the storm raging in his chest. He wouldn't allow himself to lose focus. Not now. He would find a way to take back what was his. Sophia may have surprised him, but that was all this was, a temporary setback. His phone buzzed. Jordan's name flashed on the screen. Tell me you have something, William said as he lifted the glass to his lips. There was a hesitation on the other end. I have news, Jordan said carefully. William lowered the glass, his grip tightening. What kind of news? Jordan exhaled. Sophia just called for a shareholder meeting. It's happening tomorrow morning. William went still. She's planning something big, Jordan continued. Word around the office is that she's going to make changes, significant ones. Some board members are already considering shifting their full support to her if they haven't already. You need to get ahead of this, William. William set his drink down on the bar, his jaw locking. He had assumed she would make her move eventually, but he hadn't expected it to be this soon. Give me the full details, he said. I want to know exactly what she's planning before she announces it. Jordan hesitated again. William, there's something else. A few of your biggest investors have been taking meetings with Sophia. Some of them are considering pulling out if they think the company is stronger under her leadership. The words hit harder than he expected. His investors, the men and women who had built their fortunes alongside him, who had trusted him to keep Morrison Enterprises at the top. The thought that they were even considering abandoning him for her sent a fresh wave of anger surging through him. Find out who they are, he said, his voice sharp. Set up meetings with them. I don't care what it takes. I need to make sure they stay with me. Jordan sighed. I'll do what I can. But William, You might need to consider an alternative strategy. This isn't just a fight for control anymore. This is about reputation. And right now, Sophia's is stronger than yours." William ended the call without responding. Reputation. That word echoed in his mind long after he tossed his phone onto the couch. It wasn't something he had ever worried about before. His results had always spoken for themselves. But now, results weren't enough. Now, people were looking at her as the future. And that was unacceptable. Sophia sat in her office long after the rest of the building had emptied for the night, the glow of the city illuminating the space. The shareholder meeting was set, the plan in motion. Every step had been calculated, every move designed to secure her position and ensure that William couldn't manipulate his way back into power. But she knew him. She knew how he operated, how he thought. He wouldn't take this loss quietly. A soft knock at the door broke her focus. She glanced up to see Elena leaning against the frame, her arms crossed. "You're really going for it," Elena said, stepping inside. Sophia nodded. "It's the only way." Elena studied her for a moment before moving toward the window, gazing out at the skyline. "You've done the impossible, you know. A year ago, no one would have believed that Sophia Monroe could take down William Morrison. But here you are." Sophia exhaled slowly. "I'm not just here to take him down, Elena. I'm here to build something better." Elena smirked. "And yet, you haven't once asked what happens if he fights back harder than you expect." Sophia met her gaze, unflinching. "I don't underestimate him. I never have. But he underestimates me. And that's why I'm going to win." Elena nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "Just make sure you know what winning really looks like." Sophia didn't respond, because she wasn't entirely sure she did. The next morning, William arrived at the office earlier than usual. The tension in the building was palpable. People whispered in corners, exchanged glances as he walked past. The weight of what was happening was pressing down on everyone. When he stepped into the conference room for the shareholder meeting, Sophia was already there, seated at the head of the table. William took his usual seat without a word. She met his gaze with calm confidence. "Good morning, William." He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Let's get this over with." Sophia turned her attention to the room. "As many of you are aware, recent changes in leadership have led to a shift in company structure. My goal is simple: to ensure the long-term success and stability of Morrison Enterprises. In order to do that, I'm proposing a new strategy, one that prioritizes innovation, sustainability, and growth in emerging markets." William listened, his expression unreadable as she laid out her plan. It was solid, brilliant, even. She wasn't just trying to push him out. She was reinventing the company. And the worst part? The board was eating it up. He could see it in their faces, the way they nodded along, the way they believed in her. When she finished, a murmur of approval rippled through the room. One of the board members leaned forward. "This is bold, Sophia, but it's exactly what this company needs." William clenched his fists beneath the table. Then, another voice spoke. "I move that we vote to make these changes effective immediately." William's stomach tightened. A vote. Sophia's eyes flickered toward him for the briefest of moments before she leaned back in her chair, waiting. The votes were cast. And when the results were announced, William knew. He had lost. The meeting adjourned, people filtering out with quiet excitement. William remained seated, staring at the empty table. Sophia stood. "You knew this was coming, William." He exhaled slowly. "You think this is over?" She tilted her head. "No. But I think, for the first time, you're realizing that you're not invincible." He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You want to run my company? Fine. Let's see if you can handle what comes next." Sophia didn't flinch. "I already have." She turned, walking away. And for the first time in his life, William Morrison felt what it was like to be truly powerless. William sat in his office, the city stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but for the first time in his life, he felt caged. The empire he had built, the legacy he had spent years cultivating, was slipping from his grasp, and no matter how hard he tried to push back, he was losing ground. He had watched Sophia dismantle him piece by piece, and the worst part was that she wasn't just taking over, she was excelling. The board meetings were no longer battles where she struggled to keep up. She led them with confidence, with precision, and with an undeniable command that left people questioning whether he had ever been the right person to lead Morrison Enterprises in the first place. The whispers in the hallways were louder now. Employees who once jumped at the chance to impress him now hesitated, unsure if their loyalty was misplaced. Investors who had once relied on his vision now looked to Sophia, seeing in her something he had never considered a threat: stability. She wasn't just a woman who had taken power out of spite. She was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. William's phone rang, dragging him from his thoughts. He picked it up without checking the caller ID. "Tell me you have good news," he said, his voice tight. Jordan hesitated. That was never a good sign. "I tried to get ahead of the board's decision, but Sophia's already moving faster than we anticipated. She's locking in new partnerships, restructuring key departments, and what?" William snapped. Jordan sighed. "And she's cutting the fat, William. She's dissolving divisions that were underperforming, reallocating resources, streamlining operations. The company's already seeing an increase in projected revenue under her leadership. People are paying attention. They trust her." William clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't care what the numbers say. There has to be a way to push her out. Find it." "I don't think she's giving us an opening," Jordan admitted. "She's playing the long game, and she's playing it well. Even if we find something, she's protected herself legally. You taught her too well." William closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. "Then we hit her where she doesn't expect it." A pause. Then Jordan spoke carefully. "You mean personal?" William's fingers drummed against the desk. He had always believed that business and personal affairs should remain separate, but this wasn't just business anymore. This was war. "Find out what she values most," William said, "and then we make sure she has to fight for it." Jordan didn't respond right away. Then, finally, understood. William hung up, his mind already racing with possibilities. Sophia had fought her way into his world, but she didn't understand what it truly meant to survive in it. She had taken everything from him, but now he was going to remind her why he had been at the top in the first place. Sophia sat in her new office, reviewing a series of reports. Every move she had made so far had been calculated, precise, ensuring that no matter what William did, he would find no way to regain control. She had solidified her leadership, gained the trust of the investors, and restructured the company into something stronger than it had ever been under his reign. And yet, she knew this wasn't over. William wasn't the type to surrender. If anything, he was at his most dangerous when he was losing. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Elena stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "You look exhausted," Elena remarked, taking a seat across from her. Sophia let out a tired breath. "It's been a long week." Elena smirked. "And it's about to get longer." Sophia frowned. "What do you mean?" Elena slid a folder across the desk. "William's making moves. And not in the boardroom." Sophia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until she saw the names listed in the reports. People she had worked with. People she had trusted. "He's trying to turn them against me," she muttered. Elena nodded. "And he's not being subtle about it. He's using every connection he has, reminding them of the deals he made for them in the past, whispering in their ears that you don't have what it takes to keep this company afloat in the long run. He's planting seeds of doubt, and sooner or later, someone is going to believe him." Sophia clenched her jaw, closing the folder. "Let him try." Elena studied her for a moment before leaning back in her chair. "You're handling this well. Better than I expected." Sophia met her gaze. "I didn't come this far to lose, Elena." Elena smirked. "Good. Because neither did I." William watched as the first signs of resistance began to appear. It was subtle, minor hesitations in meetings, small delays in decision-making, whispers that trickled through the ranks like smoke before a fire. He knew how to manipulate doubt, how to turn loyalty into uncertainty. He had done it countless times before, and he was going to do it again. But what he hadn't expected was how quickly Sophia adapted. She countered every move with precision, reinforcing trust where he tried to plant doubt, exposing his manipulations before they had time to take root. She wasn't just reacting, she was anticipating him. And that was what truly infuriated him. He needed a new approach. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out to Sophia directly. She was in the middle of reviewing financial reports when her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number at first, but something in her gut told her who it was. She answered without hesitation. "William, you sound surprised," he said. "I'm not." A pause. "Then, we need to talk." Sophia leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "About what?" "The fact that you're trying to sabotage me?" Or the fact that it's not working? William chuckled, though there was no real humor in it. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Sophia tilted her head. I'm enjoying proving you wrong. Another pause. Then William sighed. Meet me for dinner. Sophia raised an eyebrow. You expect me to just walk into whatever game you're playing? No games, William said. Just a conversation. Sophia considered it. She knew better than to trust him, knew that whatever he was planning, it wouldn't be in her favor. But at the same time, she was curious. Curious to see what he looked like now that he was losing. Fine, she said. Tomorrow night. 8 o'clock. William smirked. I'll see you then. He hung up, a slow grin spreading across his face. Sophia thought she had won. But this battle was far from over. William arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes early, an unusual move for a man who was accustomed to making others wait. He chose a corner table, one that gave him a clear view of the entrance, a strategic position that allowed him to observe before being observed. He had picked this place deliberately, a restaurant where he had closed countless deals, a place where he had always been in control. But tonight, for the first time, he wasn't sure what control even looked like. He had spent the last few weeks clawing to regain his grip on Morrison Enterprises, planting doubts, pulling strings, making promises he had never planned to keep. Anything to weaken Sophia's position. But no matter what he did, she countered it before he had a chance to fully execute. It was infuriating. She wasn't just reacting to his attacks. She was predicting them, dismantling his strategies before they even had a chance to take root. He had underestimated her once, and that had been his greatest mistake. But he wouldn't make it again. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the golden liquid catch the light, a calculated attempt to project ease. But the moment she walked in, he felt something he wasn't accustomed to. Not anger, not resentment, something else. A slow, twisting realization that he wasn't just losing a battle, he was losing to her. Sophia moved through the restaurant with an ease that made his jaw tighten, her confidence undeniable. She wasn't the woman he had left behind. She wasn't clinging to survival, wasn't trying to reclaim lost dignity. She had redefined herself, and the air around her carried that certainty. The hostess led her to the table, but Sophia didn't need guidance. She already knew where she was going. She lowered herself into the chair across from him, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't fidget, didn't break eye contact, didn't waste energy pretending to be polite. William smirked, leaning back slightly. You're early, he said. You're early, she countered, arching a brow. William's smirk didn't falter, but he felt the sting of it. Sophia had always been sharp, but she had never been this precise, this composed. She had learned his game, and she had learned how to beat him at it. The waiter approached, pouring her a glass of wine without needing to ask. She had been here before. She knew the menu. She knew the setting. This wasn't his world anymore. It was theirs, and that made him uneasy in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. So, Sophia said after taking a slow sip of her wine, setting the glass down with practiced ease. Why are we here? William tilted his head, pretending to consider the question. Because I wanted to see if you're actually enjoying this as much as you pretend to be. She didn't blink. And what is this exactly? The game, William said, watching her carefully. Because that's what this is, isn't it? You wanted to win. And congratulations, Sophia, you did. You took my company, you took my position, and you made sure I couldn't do a damn thing about it. Sophia exhaled softly, and for a second, he thought she might actually soften, might acknowledge that this was bigger than corporate maneuvering. But then she leaned in slightly, resting her elbows on the table, and when she spoke, her voice was as smooth as silk. William, she said, if you think this is just about a game, then you still don't understand what's happening. His fingers curled around the base of his glass, his jaw locking for a brief second before he forced himself to relax. Then explain it to me. Sophia studied him for a moment before shaking her head, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. You always think everything is about power, don't you? About control. About who holds the most leverage. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you actually built something, William? When was the last time you did something that wasn't about making yourself untouchable? William stiffened, but before he could respond, she continued. You built an empire, she admitted. You shaped Morrison Enterprises into something powerful, something influential. But at what cost? You never invested in people, never thought beyond your own ambitions. And now, For the first time, you're seeing what happens when the world realizes they don't need you as much as you thought they did. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that his methods had worked, that his approach had made him a leader, not just a businessman. But the truth was, she had hit a nerve, and she knew it. William exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. "What do you want from me, Sophia?" She tilted her head. "I don't want anything from you. That's the difference between us." The word should have been a final blow, the kind of cutting remark that left no room for counterattacks. But instead, it did something far worse. It made him realize how much he had lost. Not just the company, not just control, but her. The woman sitting across from him wasn't just an opponent. She was someone he had never fully understood, and now that he did, it was too late. Sophia finished the last of her wine and placed the glass down gently before reaching for her purse. "I don't need to be here anymore," she said, standing. This conversation was a courtesy, William. A final moment of acknowledgement before we stop pretending that this is about anything other than what it is. William stayed seated, watching as she smoothed out the front of her blazer, her posture effortlessly composed. She didn't want to see him fall. That was the worst part. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to move forward, and in doing so, she was leaving him behind. As she turned to leave, William finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Sophia." She hesitated, but she didn't turn around. His throat tightened slightly. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, what he could say that would change anything. But for the first time, there was no strategy, no calculated words. Just something raw and unfamiliar clawing at the edges of his mind. "Did you ever love me?" Sophia closed her eyes briefly before exhaling softly. When she finally turned back to face him, her expression was unreadable. "I did," she said, "and that's why I survived you." Then, without another word, she walked away, leaving him sitting alone at a table where he had once dictated the course of his own destiny. William sat there long after she was gone, staring at the empty space where she had been. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to lose. William sat in his penthouse, the skyline of the city stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but for once, he wasn't admiring the view. The whiskey in his glass sat untouched beside him, the ice melting slowly, diluting the amber liquid. He had barely moved since he arrived home from dinner, still replaying the conversation with Sophia over and over in his head. He had lost before, small battles, minor setbacks, but this was different. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It wasn't about the board, the investors, or the empire he had spent years building. This was about him. The realization that Sophia had truly won wasn't just humiliating. It was something worse, something he didn't even know how to name. She had walked away without looking back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she had nothing left to prove. And that was what made it unbearable. He had spent weeks trying to regain control, throwing everything he had at her, only to realize that she didn't need his validation, his approval, or even his downfall. She had simply moved on. He leaned forward, rubbing his temples as frustration curled in his gut. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being untouchable to this? His phone vibrated against the table, pulling him from his thoughts. He ignored it at first, assuming it was Jordan or another one of his so-called allies, trying to reassure him that things could still be salvaged. But when it buzzed again, a different kind of instinct kicked in. He grabbed the phone and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, a familiar voice. "William." His fingers tightened around the phone. "Sophia," he said slowly. "To what do I owe the honor?" She exhaled softly. "I didn't call to fight. I just wanted to say something." William let out a humorless laugh. "That's new." There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, he thought she might hang up. But then, her voice came through again, steady and controlled. "I don't regret anything, William. Not taking the company. Not walking away. But for what it's worth, I don't hate you. I just don't care anymore." The words hit harder than they should have. He had been prepared for anger, for coldness, for another reminder of how thoroughly she had dismantled him. But indifference? That was worse. That was unbearable. "So that's it?" he said, keeping his voice level despite the tightness in his chest. "You get your revenge, and now you disappear?" "This was never about revenge," she said. "Not really." William exhaled sharply, standing and walking toward the window, staring at his own reflection against the backdrop of the city. Then what the hell was it about, Sophia? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like payback. You never understood, did you? She said, almost softly. It was about respect. About proving to myself that I was never as powerless as you made me feel. He clenched his jaw. And now you feel powerful. Now I feel free. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. William swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. What happens now? Sophia hesitated before answering. That's up to you, William. You can keep fighting me. Keep trying to reclaim something that's already gone. Or you can figure out who you are without all of this. William closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her words settling deep into his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. And who do you think I am? She didn't answer right away. And when she finally did, her voice was softer than before. That's something only you can decide. The line went dead. William stood there, phone still in his hand, staring at nothing. For the first time in his life, there was no clear path forward. No next move, no strategy to regain control. Just an emptiness he didn't know how to fill. And for the first time in his life, William Morrison wasn't sure if he even wanted to. What happens to a man like him when he loses everything that defined him? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as he stared at the untouched glass of whiskey sitting on the table before him. He had spent years priding himself on control, of his company, of his relationships, of his future. But right now, control was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp it. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. The shareholder vote had been the final blow. He had watched from his seat as Sophia solidified her position, the board members who had once hung on his every word now turning to her with quiet deference. The men and women who had once followed him unquestioningly had shifted their loyalties, not because they despised him, but because they no longer needed him. That was the most painful truth of all. Sophia hadn't just replaced him. She had made them forget why they had ever needed him in the first place. His phone vibrated against the glass table, snapping him from his thoughts. He reached for it absently, glancing at the screen. Jordan. He let it ring twice before answering. Tell me you have something useful, William said, his voice quieter than usual. There was a pause on the other end. That depends on what you consider useful. William exhaled sharply. Just say it. Jordan hesitated before continuing. It's over, William. The board is fully backing Sophia. Investors are siding with her. Even the people who were loyal to you are starting to see her as the better leader. William clenched his jaw, gripping the phone tighter. And the legal side? She's already tied up everything. The contracts, the restructuring, even the assets you thought she wouldn't touch. She's cutting out anything connected to you, making sure there's no way for you to manipulate the company from the outside. William let the words settle, his mind processing every implication. He had built Morrison Enterprises from the ground up, shaped it into something that had once felt untouchable. And yet, Sophia had done what no competitor, no market crash, no scandal had ever been able to do. She had erased him. What's left? William asked after a long silence. Jordan hesitated. Your name. And even that won't mean much soon. William let out a quiet, humorless laugh. He should have seen this coming. He had spent years making decisions that benefited himself, ensuring that he was always several steps ahead. And yet, when it had mattered most, he had failed to anticipate the one move that had mattered most. He had always believed that losing was temporary, that there was always another way back. But for the first time, he was starting to wonder if that was true. Do you want me to start looking for a way to salvage anything? Jordan asked, his tone cautious. William considered it. The old version of himself would have said yes without hesitation, would have ordered Jordan to find every possible loophole, every weak point in Sophia's strategy. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't sure when it had happened. Maybe in that last board meeting, maybe when he saw Sophia take his place at the head of the table, or maybe, just maybe, it had started long before then, back when he had walked away from her thinking she was nothing more than an afterthought. No, William said finally. There's nothing left to salvage. Jordan was quiet for a moment before sighing. I figured you'd say that. What now? William didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he had an answer at all. I'll let you know, he said finally, then ended the call before Jordan could ask anything else. The silence in the penthouse was louder than before, pressing in on him from all sides. He had spent years thriving in solitude, convincing himself that power was the only thing that mattered, that the world could be conquered through sheer force of will. And yet, here he was, alone, truly alone, with no one left to conquer. He stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to breathe, but even as he walked across the room, the weight in his chest refused to lift. He had spent years chasing control, shaping his life into something that made sense only in the context of winning. But what did a man like him do when there was no more battle left to fight? His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. William. The voice on the other end was familiar. Calm. Steady. Sophia. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment before responding. To what do I owe the pleasure? Sophia was quiet for a second before speaking. I heard you lost the last of your shares today. William smirked, though there was no humor in it. And what? You called to gloat. Seems beneath you. No, she said simply. I called because, despite everything, I thought you should hear it from me. William frowned slightly, caught off guard by the sincerity in her voice. Hear what? That this doesn't have to be the end for you, she said. You built something incredible, William. You were brilliant, ruthless, and at times, completely insufferable. But the truth is, you don't have to keep chasing something that's already gone. William let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. And what exactly do you suggest I do instead? Sophia hesitated, then said something he hadn't expected. Figure out who you are without it. The words cut deeper than anything else she had said to him before. Not because they were cruel, but because they weren't. Because for the first time in his life, someone wasn't telling him to fight, wasn't telling him to win at all costs. They were telling him to stop. The line was silent for a moment before she added, I didn't call to argue. I just thought you should hear that from someone who actually knows you. William swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. And you think you still know me? I know who you were, she said softly. Now it's up to you to decide who you'll be. William exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. And what about you? You've already figured that out. Sophia was quiet for a second before answering. I know that I'm finally free. William closed his eyes, the weight of those words settling in his chest. Free. She had freed herself from him, from his shadow, from the power he had once held over her. And now, for the first time, he realized something. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to free himself too. The line clicked dead. William sat there, staring at the phone in his hand, then slowly set it down. The empire was gone. The game was over. The battle had ended. And all that remained was the question he had never dared to ask himself before. Who was William Morrison, if he wasn't the man on top? William woke up to the unfamiliar sound of silence. No phone buzzing with urgent messages, no scheduled calls demanding his attention, no meetings waiting for his approval. For the first time in years, there was nothing. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, the early morning light creeping in through the edges of the blackout curtains. The space felt too big, too quiet, as if it belonged to someone else now. The past few weeks had been a blur of losses, one after another, until there was nothing left to lose. His company, his legacy, was now in Sophia's hands, and the world had already started adjusting to it. His name was disappearing from headlines, his influence shrinking faster than he could grasp. He had spent his entire life chasing power, convinced that control was the only thing that mattered, that his success was the only validation he would ever need. And now, stripped of all of it, he was left with a question he didn't know how to answer. Who was he, if he wasn't the man in charge? He sat up, rubbing a hand down his face before swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. His body felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion that wasn't physical but mental, the kind of fatigue that came from realizing you had built your entire life on something that could be taken away in an instant. The empire he had built had been made of glass, and Sophia had shattered it piece by piece. But the worst part wasn't losing the company. It was realizing that she had been right. He stood, walking toward the massive windows overlooking the city. The streets below were already alive with movement, people rushing to jobs, chasing their own ambitions, just as he had once done. But now, for the first time, he wasn't a part of that race. He was standing on the outside, looking in. His phone sat on the nightstand, still silent. He reached for it, hesitating for a moment before unlocking the screen. He scrolled through messages, most of them from people who had once called themselves allies, now offering empty condolences, trying to distance themselves from him without making it too obvious. Investors who had once hung on his every word were now firmly in Sophia's camp. Board members who had sworn loyalty had barely hesitated before shifting their allegiance. One name stood out among the messages. Sophia. Her last message to him was short. I hope you figure it out. He exhaled, setting the phone down. Figure it out. The words followed him as he moved through his morning routine, showering, dressing, going through the motions of a man who still had purpose. But he didn't. Not anymore. The offices of Morrison Enterprises were no longer his to walk into. The meetings, the negotiations, the calculated power plays that had once defined his days, they belonged to someone else now. He had spent so much time fighting to stay on top that he had never considered what it meant to simply exist outside of that. And for the first time, he wondered if he had ever actually lived at all. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By noon, he found himself in a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. The streets here weren't lined with glass skyscrapers or private clubs where deals were made over expensive whiskey. No one wore $1,000 suits. No one was waiting for a personal driver. It was real, raw, the kind of place he had long since left behind. He wasn't sure what had drawn him here. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet part of his mind that had started asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the small, lingering thought that Sophia had been right about him all along. He walked without direction, his hands in his pockets, until he spotted something unexpected. A community center, its doors propped open, voices filtering out into the street. He paused, watching as people moved in and out, some laughing, some deep in conversation, some carrying bags of donated supplies. It was the kind of place he would have ignored before. But today he walked inside. The interior was simple, worn chairs, scuffed floors, walls lined with flyers for programs he had never paid attention to before. A woman at the front desk glanced up as he entered, offering a polite smile. Can I help you? William hesitated. He had no reason to be here, nothing to ask for, nothing to offer. And yet, for some reason, he didn't turn around and leave. He stopped, exhaling. I don't know. The woman studied him for a moment before nodding toward a bulletin board. We have volunteer programs. If you're looking for something to do. Something to do. It was a foreign concept. His life had always been structured, calculated, every hour accounted for. And now, he was standing in a place where time wasn't dictated by profit margins, but by something else entirely. His gaze drifted to a flyer pinned to the board. Financial literacy workshops. He frowned slightly. People actually come to these? More than you'd think, the woman replied. A lot of people don't know how to manage money, how to invest, how to build something for themselves. We try to give them the tools to change that. Something about that struck him. He had spent years making money, manipulating markets, mastering how to win. But he had never once considered what it meant to teach someone else how to do it for themselves. He wasn't sure why, but he heard himself say, I know a thing or two about business. The woman raised an eyebrow. Is that so? William nodded. I built a company from nothing. And yet, here you are, she said, not unkindly. He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, here I am. She studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the sign-up sheet. We could use more people who actually know what they're talking about. If you're interested. William looked at the paper, then back at her. Volunteering. Teaching. Giving something without expecting power in return. It wasn't a move he had ever considered. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time to start making moves that weren't about winning, but about something else entirely. He reached for the pen, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was chasing something. He just felt human. William adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his movements slow, deliberate. The conference room was silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the quiet tapping of fingers against keyboards. The board members sat in a semicircle around the long, polished table, their gazes flickering between him and Sophia, who stood at the head of the room with the same unwavering confidence that had unnerved him since the day she took control. She had called this meeting, and he knew exactly why. This was the final move, the closing chapter of a game he had once thought he would never lose. Today, they weren't here to argue over shares, or votes, or policies. No, today was about him. The last remnant of his reign. Sophia cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. I wanted to make this as direct as possible, she began, her voice calm, professional. Now that the transition is complete, The company is fully under my leadership. That means it's time to finalize the last piece of unfinished business. William's position within Morrison Enterprises. William leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, watching her. She was always careful with her words, methodical in her delivery. It was one of the things that had once drawn him to her, that quiet intelligence lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The board has reviewed everything, she continued. And based on the current structure, there are two options moving forward. 1. William formally steps down from any remaining advisory role, completely separating himself from the company. Or 2. He transitions into a new role, one that would keep him within the organization but in a different capacity. The room was silent. Everyone was waiting for his response. He glanced around at the familiar faces, men and women who had once backed him without hesitation, who had celebrated his victories and benefited from his success. Now, they were looking at him like a relic, an artifact from a past they were ready to move on from. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if they were wrong. He exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the table before shifting his gaze back to Sophia. And what exactly is this different capacity? She didn't hesitate. An advisory role in business development. You wouldn't have control, but you'd have influence. You'd be part of the company's growth, but without the final say. It's a position built on expertise, not power. William let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. So, you're offering me a seat at the table, but not my table. Sophia met his gaze, unflinching. I'm offering you a chance to stay connected to the company in a way that actually benefits it. He studied her for a long moment. There was no mockery in her tone, no satisfaction in seeing him brought to this point. If anything, she sounded sincere. That was what made this choice so much harder. He had spent so long assuming this battle would end in total victory or complete defeat, but now, she was handing him something he hadn't considered, a middle ground. A chance to be something else. But was that something he could accept? The room was still waiting. He could feel their anticipation, the unspoken curiosity hanging in the air. Was William Morrison about to walk away quietly? He exhaled, rubbing his jaw before finally sitting up straighter. Let's be honest here, Sophia, he said, his voice steady. You don't need me in this company. Not anymore. You've proven that. A flicker of something crossed her expression, but she didn't interrupt. So why offer me this? He asked. She was quiet for a second before replying. Because I know what it's like to have nothing left to fight for. Her words landed harder than he expected. She knew. She knew exactly what this felt like. William swallowed, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He could walk away. He could sign the papers, disappear into whatever existence was waiting for him outside of this building, and leave it all behind. But then what? What was left for a man who had built his identity on always being the one in control? He thought of the last few weeks, the silence of his penthouse, the mornings without urgency, the hollow feeling of waking up without purpose. He thought about the volunteer center, about the finance classes he had unexpectedly found himself drawn to, about the way people actually listened, not because they had to, not because he was powerful, but because they wanted to learn. And then he thought about her, about Sophia sitting across from him, offering him something no one else ever had. A choice, not an ultimatum, not a demand. A choice to be more than the man he had always been. For the first time in his life, William Morrison made a decision that wasn't based on power. He leaned forward, meeting Sophia's gaze with something different in his eyes. All right, he said, voice steady. Let's see if I can actually be useful. A quiet murmur spread across the room as the decision settled, as the shift became real. Sophia nodded, her expression unreadable. Then it settled. William sat back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't the ending he had expected. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better.